right. Can you hear me okay? All right, folks, we're going to get started with our evening programming. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. I'm nervous, of course, but I'm so glad everyone is here for our banquet tonight, and we're going to start the evening programming. We just wanted to make a few acknowledgments for the event. There's been a lot of people involved with this. The event started back in February of last year around a kitchen table where my wife and I were contemplating doing something because we knew this year would be the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 1 tragedy. And being a historian and working with NASA, anytime an anniversary ends in a 0 or a 5, usually it's important. And if the anniversary is 5 and a 0 together, as in 50 or half a century, it's even more important. So we wanted to put something together that would increase the awareness of who Roger B. Chaffee was and his contributions to the space program. We didn't want to make it a wake because we wanted to make it a celebration in honor or recognition of the contribution that Chaffee and his fellow crewmates made 50 years ago, this past January 27th. And so when we were putting all this together, we made it a celebration of space exploration so that people could look forward as well as learn from the past. And so getting from that point of the inspiration, the idea, to using the perspiration to get to the event is what brought us here. And in doing that, there were a lot of people involved other than just the two of us that came up with the idea. And I kind of want to recognize some of those folks this evening briefly, because I know a lot of them are here attending tonight. So I'm going to call out a few of their names and just hold off applause, but I do want to give a round of applause for those folks that were involved. We have Dave Paquette here, who's the nephew of Roger B. Chaffee and on the Chaffee Scholarship Fund. He was very important in allowing us to make connections with the Chaffee and supporting a lot of the networking with them to bring them here this evening. And we have Matt Cushman and his wife are here. Matt is a graphic artist, and he put together the program, which I know there are a lot of people who are geeks here this evening and are very interested in the space program. And that program was designed after an actual flight program that NASA used for the Apollo missions, the format on it. So if you don't have one, feel free to pick one up before you leave as a souvenir. But he was involved in putting that together, as well as a lot of the other signage graphics. We also have Tim Eldred with Marvel Comics, who came up with our Roger That logo that we've used. So a lot of those people work behind the scenes. We also have Grand Valley State University and the various departments that contributed both funds as well as folks. Charlie Stanridge, who's not here this evening, but was involved with the College of Engineering. We have Samantha Rhodes, who's here. We have Karen Gibson from the Physics Department. We have, let me see, who am I forgetting? My wife, who's here, of course. I better not forget that. Dave DeBruyn, I'm going to introduce shortly. He's going to be here as well. So please, those folks, if you would stand and be recognized, and you definitely need and Samantha Rhodes, excuse me, you're here as well. Did I say it? Okay. See, I'm nervous, so. But please stand, at least let's recognize you folks for helping out. All right, so Roger Chaffee, of course, for those of you who visited our website or perhaps not familiar with him, was originally born in Grand Rapids. He lived in Greenville, Michigan with his folks. And of course, he was associated with the Apollo 1 fire. He was chosen by NASA to be an astronaut in 1963. And because of the tragedy, the sacrifice that he made really allowed us to go to the moon. In fact, it is the common view, and I support this wholly, is that if the accident didn't occur when it did on the ground, chances are there would have been something that would have happened down the road and perhaps even in space that would have been even more tragic, if that's possible, and perhaps would have terminated the Apollo program because of the scale of it. So his sacrifice certainly was not in vain, because there were many changes made, not only to the spacecraft, but the program as well. But because of his sacrifice and his connection with the area here, still some folks don't know of him, much about him. I teach out at Grand Valley in the physics department, and I always am impressed when students come in wearing the NASA meatball, the logo, the NASA logo, either on a patch or a t-shirt. It's not very often that you see young people wear a symbol like that from a federal agency. And I will often take the time to ask them about why you are wearing that. Are you interested in the space program? And they will often reply that yes, they are, and that they would like to pursue a career in aerospace, both men and women, or they're just very supportive of the space program in general. And then if there's time, I'll often ask them, do you know of Roger B. Chaffee? And ask them if they remember that name, and they'll say, well, Chaffee, yeah, isn't that the name of the planetarium? Okay, which is fine, because that certainly is here in town, but they don't know too much about him unless they've had a chance to visit the planetarium and see some of the fine exhibits there that show the life of Roger B. Chaffee. So one of the goals of our event was to increase awareness of him. And there are a few things in town here that do have the Chaffee name. One of them, if you're not aware of it, is Roger B. Chaffee Memorial Boulevard, which is not very far from where I live and where I grew up in Wyoming. And that is actually built upon the old runway of the original Kent County Airport before it moved in 1964 to its present location. And when that move occurred, the founders of the city decided to name the boulevard after Roger B. Chaffee. And when I was working at the old Lear plant over there back in the mid-90s, one of the things that I would often do is during my lunchtime when the weather was nice, I would walk out onto that boulevard just for exercise and kind of a tension release thing. And a few days in one summer, they were resurfacing the pavement on that boulevard. They were taking up the old asphalt. And they took up the old asphalt right down to, you know, the surface. Usually it's about a foot deep or whatever for heavy roads. And I stopped in my tracks one time when I was walking by seeing this, and I saw yellow paint under this surface. And what it was were the old runway markings from that original airport. And so when they were working on it, there weren't any folks around here, so I just kind of wandered around and walked on it. And it was a great feeling knowing that I was walking on the runway that Roger B. Chaffee landed on when he would visit his folks when he was living here in Grand Rapids. So when you folks drive on that strip, you are driving on the old runway where Roger Chaffee once flew his training aircraft, and once with his dad as he was growing up and learning how to fly in the area. There's also an American Legion post here in town, which I did not know about, called the Roger B. Chaffee Post out on Byron Center Avenue north of 28th Street. And that was something I just learned as we were organizing this event. But of course that brings us to the Roger B. Chaffee Planetarium, which is perhaps the most well-known landmark named after the Chaffee family. And it's to this that I'd like to start our programming, because we're going to have a brief 10-minute presentation by the Director Emeritus of the Chaffee Planetarium, Dave DeBruyn, because it's not only the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 1 accident, but it's also the 50th anniversary of the naming of the Chaffee Planetarium, because it was named the same year that Chaffee passed away. In fact, in that spring, in May, was the renaming of it, and Dave will talk about that shortly. So we have a brief presentation by Dave with some slides that he will we'll show together about the planetarium, and then we'll move from there. So without further delay, I want to introduce Dave, who I'm sure most of the local folks here know of him as being here forever. Very active in the local community and promoting astronomical events through his month or weekly column, West Michigan Skies, which I understand is one of the longest, if not the longest, column in the Grand Rapids Press as far as duration. Not the length of the columns, actually, although some of them are quite long and very informative, but just being for the number of years that he's spent time and effort on that. He's very much involved, of course, with the Great Lakes Amateur Astronomical Association and the Grand Rapids Amateur Astronomical Association, and the local planetarium organization in the Great Lakes region here. So without further ado, let's bring Dave forward and we'll start with his program.
Thank you, Glenn. I couldn't help but notice that you mentioned brief 3 times in your introduction. So am I getting the message?
Yes.
Yes, I have another reputation, and that is not knowing when to shut up. So this time I'm going to very much stick to the allotted time and just bring you up to date a little bit on the story behind the naming of the planetarium after Roger B. Chaffee. And it really starts about 5 years prior to that, when the planetarium was open in 1962. And then a couple of years later, after that, I had the very good fortune, probably one of the best things that ever happened in my whole life, of being able to be named the head curator for that planetarium, and came to Grand Rapids almost with a carte blanche on the part of the administration to build some kind of educational and scientific program around the planetarium, which in those days was a rather funny-looking centipede machine that sat in the middle of a 30-foot diameter theater. The original planetariums seated about 88 people, and it was really quite cramped quarters, all things considered. And you'll notice that the new curator came with a halo around his head, which I assure you he did not earn. But the enjoyment that I got over those early years of giving programs and introducing space and astronomy and trying to develop some of the programming in the planetarium was wonderful, wonderful challenge. And my mentor, what's happening? Okay, these newfangled devices. You'll notice the gentleman standing behind the console. That is Weldon D. Frankfurter, Frank as we called him, who at the time was assistant director of the museum. And he was the person who preceded me as the planetarium director, but he was on course to become director in a couple of years, but was quite a mentor to me in learning how the planetarium worked. And he plays a very big part in this story, an extremely important part. So here's Frank as a young man at the console. You notice all the high tech, including the reel-to-reel tape deck, manual, everything, and something that looked akin to a pistol as a laser pointer, which everybody thought was pretty cool, that you would project against the starry backdrop. And away we went along a road to making the planetarium something we could be proud of. We added a globe, a very large globe, and I point that out to you simply because that globe has gone everywhere that the planetarium has gone, as you will see. And as you will actually see, if you come over to the planetarium after we're done tonight, we have a really eye-popping show for you that was created by the new regime down there, and you really do need to see that. If don't worry, if you think you're going to fall asleep, you won't. So come over there and you'll see the globe as well. Well, then of course tragedy struck in 1967 with the spacecraft fire. I was away the weekend it happened and actually read the horrifying headline in the Muskegon Chronicle when I was visiting my parents. And when I came back that Sunday night, this was before answering machines, this was before email, this was before any kind of modern communication. My boss, Frank, called late that evening, apologized for calling so late. He says, but I just got to know what you think of this. He said, there's already talk about some kind of fitting memorial to Chaffee. There was talk about the new airport. And then as Glenn mentioned, they ended up with a street, which is a very, very appropriate thing as well. But he said the planetarium would be the most appropriate in my way of thinking. What do you think? Well, I was ecstatic, reminding him that there were already planetariums named after some of the Mercury and Gemini astronauts, the pioneers, and they were very much alive yet, but they already had planetariums named after them, and I just thought that was a marvelous idea. Well, Frank went to work and managed to discuss this with our board, with other leaders in the city of Grand Rapids, because the planetarium and museum were under the city of Grand Rapids, so there was some politics involved. And he was very, very persistent about it, and indeed it came to pass that the planetarium was to be named after Roger Chaffee. There was a dedication in May, I think mid-May, around the 20th of May, I believe, in 1967, in which, fittingly, astronaut in training Gene Cernan was the dedication speaker. He was a neighbor of Chaffee's when they were in training. They were great friends. They were raising young families. And I think it was through some cooperation with the Chaffee family, who was very much involved in the planning process with us for this ceremony, that we were able to pull Gene away from his training in order to be the dedication speaker for us at this very special event. And there was a dark curtain over the entryway of the planetarium that was pulled aside by Chaffee's parents and Gene Cernan to note that the sign over the planetarium entry had been changed from simply planetarium to Roger B. Chaffee Planetarium. I recall that Cernan was extraordinarily emotional when he was delivering his address, as were just about all of us in the room at the time. And so that is how the planetarium received a very special identity. And we tried very, very hard over many years that followed to make the public aware of the great sacrifice that Chaffee had made. That indeed, this was not a planetarium that was named after somebody because we really wanted to. It was because we really, really had to. We felt this was the right thing to do, and it was through Frank's perseverance that it happened, really. We also became a repository for many of the possessions of Roger Chaffee. The family worked with our curatorial staff to make sure that the museum acquired and carefully cataloged many of his personal memorabilia, some of his writings, including, I think, a essay he did when he was working toward the rank of Eagle Scout. Many of these things found their way into an exhibit. You'll see there the sash, the Eagle Scout sash, in his flight suit. And the thing that I remember the most is what's something you can't read. It's a report card from Central High School. My office was just adjacent to this exhibit. So at times when my office door was open, I would be able to hear what people were saying as they walked by the exhibit. And particularly when kids would come up there and say, "Oh my goodness, he got a C." His report card had one C on it along with all the A's and B's. But they noticed that, and they noticed that a national hero could actually perhaps struggle in at least one class during his schooling. Throughout the years, so many comments were made, and it was really one of the more popular exhibits in our extensive exhibit hall at the original planetarium. In 1992, we had our millionth visitor in that little planetarium with 88 seats and a 30-foot dome. Well, you could do the math and you could figure out how many shows that would translate to, and it was a lot. But thankfully, I had a wonderful staff of associates, and between us, we managed to make every person who visited the planetarium leave hopefully thinking that their visit had been worthwhile. We moved in 1994. In June of that year, the original Chaffee Planetarium closed, and we moved across the river to that magnificent building that is just exactly north of where we are right now, which surprisingly is 23 years old this year. It's hard to believe. And yet, that sparkling new planetarium has already received its millionth visitor. That happened a couple, 3 years ago, I think, already. So with a much larger theater and a much greater capacity, we were able to move forward very, very nicely with into the new age of digital technology. It, of course, retained the name Roger B. Chaffee Planetarium. And this gentleman right here, who was on the board, at least as an honorary member for quite a few years, and was himself an astronaut, Jack Lausma, with Grand Rapids Connections, was the rededication speaker. I want to call your attention to this gentleman right here. That's Gary Tomlinson, who is my #1 associate for 27 years. Oh my gosh, we put up with each other for 27 years. I couldn't believe it. But he was a key person as well because he handled a lot of the curatorial aspects of the Chaffee collection during the time he was with us. He retired in 2013. Or 2003, and he's doing well. He's traveling all over the country, and we see each other from time to time. We moved the globe, and we also did establish another memorabilia exhibit. I think we may be able to show that to you tonight if you come over. We'll try to make sure the lights are on up there so that you can see that particular exhibit in the lobby of the planetarium. And we have upgraded still another time in 2014, when the planetarium not only got some additional new exhibit material, but also the digital projection system was upgraded again to a really, really amazing projection system that we have there now. And I'll tell you just a little bit about that as I get close to my 10-minute allotment. Two gentlemen who played such a big role, here pictured at the 2011 Chaffee Awards banquet. The first would be, of course, Weldon Frankfurter, who was then about 91 years old, I believe. And Gary Tomlinson, who I also mentioned, was very responsible for maintaining the collection of memorabilia. And again, I cannot emphasize too strongly that Frank was really the visionary behind having this planetarium be a very fitting memorial. And in 2014, this is just amazing digital upgrade that allows us to take you to Saturn. We can fly you through the rings of Saturn. We can take you outside the Milky Way galaxy to look back. We can take you inside the atom. We can take you everywhere. And then with a flick of a button, we can put you in your backyard and look at the constellations, or take you up to the dark sky site up at the headlands and see the sky in its pristine glory from the surface of the Earth. It's all possible in the state-of-the-art planetarium that remains named in honor of Roger B. Chaffee. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Continuing on with our programming, this evening. Roger Chaffee, when he was living in Grand Rapids, went to Grand Rapids Central High School. Dave briefly mentioned that in his talk, and Grand Rapids Central is still here. And I originally did not know that he went to Grand Rapids Central High School until I started researching things. And then knowing that, and knowing that our 8-year-old son goes to Grand Rapids Central High School, I thought was a really neat connection. Is there anyone else here who has kids that perhaps go to Grand Rapids Central? It's right now, it's Grand Rapids Montessori on the corner of College and Fountain Street in Lyon, that block there. But the building is still there, and as it was many years ago, and certainly when Roger attended it. But upon his death, many of the students there wanted to do something, and so thus we start the beginnings of forming the Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship Fund. And I'm going to introduce to you our next host this evening, our speaker this evening. But I just wanted to mention that the Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship Fund has now entered its 50th year of awarding scholarships to graduates within Kent County. And from my research, and I've tried to not verify this, so until I'm proven wrong, the Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship is the oldest continuous scholarship named for a fallen astronaut here in the United States. And so I'd like to introduce our next speaker this evening, Bob Steelman. He is president of the Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship Fund. Bob is here this evening with Sheryl, his wife of 44 years, and daughter Cassandra, one of 6 children, 5 of them girls and 1 boy. Bob graduated from Michigan State University before attending the Thomas Cooley Law School, and he's been in practice here in Grand Rapids for over 30 years. And Bob will speak to us about the Chaffee Scholarship and then also act as our host to introduce our evening speaker, Sheryl Chaffee. So Bob?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for all coming to this event. I was very happy to be invited to participate with the rest of the crew, as Glen has announced earlier. And I don't mean to go through the list of thanks again, but I give particular thanks to Grand Valley State University and the efforts that Glen has made towards this celebration. We also thank all of those from the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and especially the Chaffee Planetarium, for their contributions, and that would include the Curator Emeritus, Dave, who's already addressed you, and his entourage, which is Emily, John, and Nick, who maybe you'll have a chance to meet later tonight as well, and also to the Chaffee family. Roger's daughter, Sheryl, is here with her husband, Grady, and Dave Paquette is present with his wife, Chris, and Dale Young is here as well. And so I want to thank all of you for your participation here tonight. As you're probably aware by this point, the Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship Fund was created immediately after the disaster on January 27, 1967. It was the Chaffee family and friends and students from Central that got together, raised the funds, put together the organization, drew up the charters, started the scholarship fund, and by the following spring of 1968, the first of the 49 scholarship awards to date were made. Now, my association with the scholarship fund actually began through my daughter, Kelly. My daughter, as a young girl, Girl Scout Gold Award winner, was always interested in the space program. She had a poster of the Mercury astronauts on her bedroom wall. And her favorite movie was Space Camp. Anybody seen that movie? Well, she went to Space Camp in Cape Canaveral and absolutely loved it. And so a few years later, she wanted to go to the senior space camp in Huntsville, Alabama. Next thing I know, she's a graduating senior from Northview High School, and she applies for the Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship. And lo and behold, 20 years ago, this spring, on this very stage, standing in front of President Gerald R. Ford, she was awarded the 30th Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship. And that's really important. It's important to the community, it's important to the scholar, it's important to preserve the memory of our Grand Rapids hero, Roger B. Chaffee. And I can tell you that as far as Kelly's concerned, she followed Roger's footsteps off to Illinois Institute of Technology. That's where Roger went first before going to the cradle of astronauts at Purdue. Kelly went to Illinois Institute of Technology, and with the assistance of the scholarship, she got a master's degree in aerospace engineering, and eventually getting a PhD from Illinois. But while she was doing that, she also had the opportunity to go out to California and work for NASA at the Moffett Field Ames Research Center, working on the control panel for the orbiter that we hope will someday go to Mars. Well, there's been a great many successes by the young people that receive this award. Each year, the Scholarship Fund tries to identify a group of the most outstanding high school graduates who are seeking to further their education in the field of math or the sciences relating to space exploration. And many of them have gone off and done great things, and it would take all night long to tell you about all of them, but I thought I would just mention a few because the successes sometimes come very early and are very significant. Our 2015 graduate, Camille Pinoff, was already appointed research director for the Neuroscience Student Association at the University of Michigan. Our scholar from 2010, Catherine Luchek, is working for SpaceX. Our scholar from 2008, Tara Yeager, working for Boeing. Now, we had a scholar in 2002 named Jacob Borgeli, and since I don't have time to do a 3-day symposium on the achievements of this young, brilliant PhD astrophysicist, professor, Harvard fellow, I could keep on going, but anyway, it's too much to tell you about, but he's done fabulously. And then we're happy to have with us tonight scholar number 8 from 1975, Carl Kimball, who's seated in the back, who went on to get his engineering degree in chemistry. He worked for Dow Corning, and he eventually was the chief engineer and president of BLTQ Engineering. And so we welcome Carl. This is just an example of the kinds of opportunities that the Chaffee Scholarship recipients have reached out and taken a hold of. And so on behalf of the Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship Fund, we are most pleased that all of you would participate with us in our twofold goal to honor the memory of Roger B. Chaffee and to encourage young, energetic people to follow in his footsteps, live out the honor that he has set for us, and to continue on a path of greatness. Now, I probably burned up my 5 minutes already, so we will now move on. And next, we are going to have a Roger B. Chaffee video. You're going to run that, Glenn?
Thank you, Bob. So prior to introducing Sheryl Chaffee to come up and speak, we want to show a brief video that is courtesy of the Grand Rapids Public Museum. It is shown at all of their programming at the beginning of their planetarium shows, and it's a brief 4 or 5 minute biography, basically, a summary that's very well done on Roger B. Chaffee. And so we're going to show that, and I've got it queued up here, so prior to inviting Sheryl up here, we want to show that. So just bear with me a second here, excuse me.
As human beings, we have always reached for the stars. Leaving our planet is the greatest frontier ever encountered by mankind. To see Earth from outer space, to glimpse the infinity of the cosmos, to float weightlessly. These are the dreams of a special few who have made it their life's purpose to become pioneers in outer space.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
They were the dreams of a boy from Grand Rapids. A boy who grew up to become the astronaut, Roger Bruce Chaffee.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
The year was 1962. The United States had entered into a fierce competition with the Soviet Union to explore space travel and ultimately to put a man on the moon. Following the successful Soviet launch of Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin's orbit around the Earth, President John F. Kennedy made it the nation's singular objective to win the space race. And the new Apollo program was destined to do just that. Our shot at the moon gave birth to a nation of unified optimism and a generation of scientists and engineers inspired by the romance of space and fired by patriotism. Along with fellow astronauts Gus Grissom and Edward White, Roger Chaffee was our nation's choice to fulfill this promise. To become part of the family of Apollo astronauts who set out to put a flag on that distant moon. Growing up in Grand Rapids, Roger built and flew model airplanes with his father, a former barnstorming pilot. As a student at Central High School, he was fascinated with math and physics. Long before the space race had begun, Roger had set his sights on getting to the moon. Focus, skill, and determination led him to the U.S. Navy, where he excelled as a pilot, flying critical missions during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1963, Roger was chosen from 1,800 elite applicants to join the astronaut corps. He was the very best America had to offer. For the next 2.5 years, he underwent rigorous training before being selected as the pilot for the Apollo 1 flight. Finally, the moon was within Roger's reach. But on January 27, 1967, tragedy struck. Roger Chaffee, the boy who had what it took to become a Navy fighter pilot and to ride a rocket to the moon, boarded his Apollo 1 spacecraft with Gus Grissom and Edward White for a pre-flight test. A flash fire, fueled by pure oxygen, broke out in the command module, claiming the lives of these brave men. His life cut short Before he could realize his dream, the nation mourned a hero, and the people of Grand Rapids mourned the loss of a classmate, neighbor, son, husband, father, friend. But his courage lived on. Fueled by the lessons of this tragedy, Americans now focus more energy than ever to safely conquer the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
2.5 years later, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong lived out Roger's dream. Apollo 11 landed successfully on the moon and proved to this country once more that it is indeed the astronauts who carry the spirit for our nation and bring hope and optimism for all the world. Today, we honor him, not just for dying a hero, but for living like one. A man who followed his dreams and put everything on the line for what he believed in. Because of Roger Chaffee, we are inspired to look beyond the horizon and continue to reach for the stars.
I agree with Glenn that the disaster on the ground probably was a fabulous sacrifice and gift. To think that we could go from total disaster on the ground to total success in 2.5 years is mind-boggling. By the way, did you see that family picture close to the end with a cute little girl on the far right of that photo? Was that you? We have a very special guest this evening. Sheryl Chaffee is the daughter of Martha and Roger B. Chaffee. She started working for NASA in 1983, and I understand that she just retired from working at NASA after 33 years. She spent time as an administrative specialist in safety and mission assurance, and then took on the role of real property officer at the Kennedy Space Center. And she also served as secretary of the Astronauts Memorial Foundation Board of Directors. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Sheryl Chaffee. Please come join us.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. For those of you that are old enough, do you remember where you were on January 27th, 1967? Well, I do. On that evening, I was at home in Houston watching TV with my brother Steven when one of my mother's good friends came to the house to visit. The TV was immediately turned off as we wondered what was going on. Minutes later, Michael Collins came over and asked to talk to my mother alone. A little later, my mother took us back to her bedroom to tell us our father was never coming home. That was the end of his journey on Earth, but not the end of his legacy. 50 years ago, the crew of Apollo 1 died on the launch pad at Complex 34, Cape Canaveral, Florida. Command Pilot Virgil I. Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Edward H. White II, and Pilot Roger B. Chaffee were trapped in their capsule on top of the Saturn 1B with no way to escape. In just a matter of seconds, their lives were cut short. I'm very proud to be here today with all of you to honor the crew of Apollo 1 and especially my father. and I'm really sorry that my mother was not able to make it. I'm not here to talk to you about the tragic day in history, but to talk about my father, my hero, and his legacy. It is a bit of a challenge for me to describe my father, who was taken away from me 50 years ago. After all, I was only 8 years old when he died. I had just barely started my own life. What can I tell you that you have not already read about in books, newspapers, or magazines? How do I describe my father, who I loved so much, but I had such little time to know? I think I will start with what I know in my heart. I know that he loved to fly, he loved his family, and he was the eternal Boy Scout all the way through. He truly lived the Boy Scout oath to do his duty for God and country, to help other people at all times, and to keep himself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. As you know, my father grew up in the Grand Rapids area. He was a member of the Boy Scouts and received the highest rank of Eagle Scout. At a very young age, his father, who was a barnstormer, took him for his first flight in an airplane. He grew to love flying and building model airplanes with his father. This love for flying led him to accepting a scholarship from the Naval ROTC and later receiving flight training at Purdue University. It is at Purdue where he met my beautiful mother, Martha Horn, while on a blind date. My mother has told me at first she thought he was a rather arrogant, smart aleck upperclassman, and that he thought she was a naive freshman. Apparently they both got quickly over that, as he asked her out the very next day, and they were married in August 1957. Their family grew in November 1958 when I was born, and later in July 1961 when my brother Steven was born. We were a happy family of 4. My father continued his career in the Navy and was awarded his aviator wings in 1959. He spent the majority of his Navy time in Federal reconnaissance squadrons during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and photographed Cape Canaveral, which was soon to become the future launch site of the United States manned space program. How fitting that in 1963 he was selected by NASA as one of 14 men in astronaut group 3. After being selected, he was quoted as saying, "It won't be just a throttle jockey job. Anyone can fly a plane, you know. It will be an engineering job, a tremendous scientific challenge." Well, I'm not sure if it's really that easy to fly a plane, but I am pretty sure it is a big challenge to be an astronaut. A few months later, the Chaffee family packed up and headed for Houston. And this is pretty much where my brief memories of my father take place, and I would like to share a few of those with you. My mother and father built a beautiful modern 1960s house in Nassau Bay, not far from the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Our neighbors were the likes of Gene Cernan, Michael Collins, Rusty Swikart, and their families. As Astro kids, we hung out together, went to school together, and ran around the neighborhood just like any other children would. Our fathers were gone most of the time, traveling the world for astronaut training, and our mothers were left at home to run the household and to take care of the kids. When my father and neighbor Gene Cernan would fly home after being away, they thought it was great fun to fly their T-38s low over our houses and kick in the afterburners. We knew then that they were just minutes from being home. They were pilots after all and had to make sure everyone knew they were there. Shortly after that, we would hear the loud rumble of Daddy's Corvair coming into the driveway. We always liked to call that car the tank. I believe these weekends at home were very important to him. He would do anything he could to make up for lost time. One weekend when he was home, he took Steve and me across the street to the bayou. I think we were either shrimping or throwing a cast net for bait. Anyway, apparently I decided to hang on to the net when he threw it, and all I remember is ending up in the bayou. Well, it was not like he could just walk out of that bayou. There was a pretty tall seawall, and he really had to stretch to pull me out. He saved me. He was my hero. Years later, my husband and I were having dinner at an event with Mike Collins and his daughter Ann, and we were talking about old times, running around with Astro kids, and she mentioned remembering her mother telling them to stay away from the bayou because a kid had fallen in. I was like, yep, that was me. Little did I know I was a legend in Nassau Bay. In the summer of 1966, the Chaffee family made a trip to Cocoa Beach to see where rockets were launched. We spent the week playing at the beach and touring the Space Center. Daddy took us all over the Space Center so we could see where he worked and spent so much of his time. As a little girl, the vehicle assembly building was very impressive, but the best place of all was the rubber room located under the launch pad. This room was part of the escape route for the astronauts in case of an emergency. I remember going into this large padded room with a shiny silver slide running into it. Don't you know that my brother and I wanted to be going down that slide? In the late 90s, I was able to revisit the rubber room. It brought back memories of that summer trip to Cocoa Beach and the time we got to spend together as a family. However, the rubber room was now dark, old, and dusty. Kind of a scary place. Not the fun place I thought it was when I was a child. It has since been abandoned in place and locked up. The last Christmas we had together, Daddy went all out on the Christmas decorations outside our house. My grandmother had given us 3 metal reindeer with lights. He wired those reindeer so they would flash in sequence and stagger them along the front of our house. Further down on the front of the house, he hung a giant plywood sign that he and my mother had painted to look like a Christmas card and wrote on it, "Merry Christmas from the Chaffee family." All the trees and the bushes had tiny white lights mingled in them. The entire front of the house twinkled like stars. It was beautiful. That year, our house won the Garden Club's first place Christmas decorations. This was truly a very special Christmas for us and one that I will never forget. From the ashes of the Apollo 1 fire came lessons that NASA had to learn in order to have successful flights to the moon and for further exploration of space. Fire started and spread quickly due to the use of 100% oxygen. The use of 100% oxygen was intended to reduce the weight of the vehicle. NASA redesigned the Apollo to fly with a mix of 34% oxygen. The abundance of flammable materials inside the Apollo 1 cabin also increased the risk of fire. NASA reduced the amounts of flammable materials in the crew cabin and modified the spacesuit with non-flammable material. As a result, many new materials were developed with fire safety in mind. But probably the most disturbing reason for their death is the fact that though he tried, Ed White could not open the inward opening hatch due to the pressure buildup in the capsule. NASA also found that procedures for opening the hatch were too difficult and too long during an emergency. It was then determined to fly humans safely into space, the hatch had to open outward. This still applies today. The lessons learned from the Apollo 1 fire changed the way NASA looked at the safety of the crew. Shortly after my father's death, President Johnson wrote a letter to my grandparents stating, "The nation's sadness, the world's compassion are a measure of the loss you have suffered. Yet there are no less a mark of greatness of the cause to which your son was committed and of his achievements in advancing it. To expand our knowledge of the heavens and to seek a richer life on earth for our children and generations of children to come. To succeed in that great enterprise, we must have men, superior talents, supreme courage, and surpassing dedication. Such men are rare, but Roger was among them. He will also be among us, warm in our hearts. He has done more than stretch our hand into space. He has moved us closer to the fulfillment of ancient dreams, and in doing that, he has moved all men closer." Tributes to my father's life have carried forward over the years. The Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship Foundation has already been mentioned. The Roger B. Chaffee Planetarium. The Astronaut Memorial Foundation in Florida was established to honor astronauts that have perished while on duty. NASA just recently dedicated an Apollo 1 exhibit this past January, which is located in the Apollo Saturn V Center at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Center. These memorials will keep our loved ones' memories alive and will provide inspiration for future generations to come. In 1983, I joined the NASA workforce. Walking the halls of the headquarters building and the operations and checkout building, I knew I was walking in the footsteps of my father. I worked for NASA for 33 years and just recently retired. I got to know people that were there when the fire happened, that knew my father and his crewmates, and that would have given their lives if they could have, so the crew would not have been lost. I was at work on that cold January day when the Challenger blew up and understood the loss and heartbreak those families went through, as well as those after the Columbia accident. Over the years, the pain has eased. I have learned that I cannot change the past, but I can move forward. And even though I will never forget, I can forgive. I have learned that even without my father in my life for so very long, I am still his daughter, and he will always be alive in my heart. Because of the Apollo 1 crew, the great team that worked day and night on the space program, and the families that sacrificed their loved ones, we met President Kennedy's pledge to land the man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. And we followed that with the Space Shuttle program. I was a guest at KSC to see the very first shuttle liftoff and watched almost every other shuttle launch from Florida's Space Coast. I was there for the last shuttle liftoff of Atlantis and watched its final landing at the shuttle landing facility. Now we look forward to the Space Launch System, which will be the new largest rocket in the world, the Orion capsule, in commercial flights by SpaceX and Blue Origin, just to name a few. We are in exciting new times in the space program. NASA's rocket will set us to go beyond our planet Earth again, and one day to Mars. And I know that is exactly what my father would want. He would want us to press to Mars. The crew knew the risks of space flight and accepted that risk. According to the book On Course to the Stars, the Roger B. Chaffee story, my father once said, probably the greatest thing a man can say or have as his philosophy when he has to tackle a tough job or make a big decision is the first 8 words of the Scout Oath. On my honor, I will do my best. My daddy proved that by remaining strapped in his seat while trying to relay messages of the fire in the capsule until he could speak no more. He did his best. He gave his all to God and his country, and he stayed true to self. And to that, I say, Roger that. Thank you.
Okay, next thing that we have for our program tonight is Sheryl, our talk tonight about the a new exhibit that opened down at the Kennedy Space Center, Saturn V Center. And they were just down there several weeks back to do the ribbon cutting, the grand opening of that exhibit, and she has some slides to share on that. It's a fascinating exhibit, very well done, and Sheryl was involved in putting that together. So we'll show those next, and I could just advance them here so you don't have to worry about that. Is that all right?
That'd be great,
All right.
because I am nervous. Okay, yes, this is the Apollo 1 exhibit that was opened on January 27th, 2017. The title, Ad Astra per Aspera, A Rough Road Leads to the Stars. This is the entrance going in with the picture of the three men. And then this, as you go around the corner, this is what you see. The first one is Gus Grissom, followed by Ed White, and then Roger Chaffee. So they each have their own display case. So we are going to focus on the Roger Chaffee display case. And it's hard to describe it. It's a box. It's a pretty big box. And on two sides, what you can see here they can display pictures, words, videos, and things like that. And what the story they're trying to tell is to highlight the lives and the careers of them and show their personal life too, not just that they were astronauts. So these are some more pictures that were on there. That's the one in the bathing suit is when we went to Cocoa Beach. One of his hobbies was hunting. So they tried to pick up on hobbies and get like I said, the personal side. And you can go to the next one. What happens then is this glass is called organic glass, and somehow these things are in there that shows the video. You don't see any projectors or anything, so then it fades away, and this is what's behind the glass. So there's the display with the Cutty Sark is a replica of one that he had built, a Boy Scout uniform, and some board games, I think. And this is another picture of that also. And the words in there would describe what each of the little items are inside of there. This is showing the timeline of when the fire was first reported. Again, this is on one of those screens. And then the next picture. And this is the letter from James Webb, just reported that the first Apollo crew was under test at Cape Kennedy and a fire broke out in their capsule and 3 were killed. He does not know whether it was the primary or backup crew, but believes it was the primary crew, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, from Jim Jones. So then that screen fades away, and behind it this is the hatch from Apollo 1. And then this is the new hatch that was developed. So the idea is to show how they progressed and some of the changes that they made for future missions. And this is a quote. They had quotes from each one of the astronauts. This one I really liked a lot. The world itself looks cleaner and so much more beautiful. Maybe we can make it that way, the way God intended it to be, by giving everyone eventually that new perspective from out in space. That's pretty good. And then this is a picture of one of the plaques that is out at Complex 34. I don't think I can read it. Can you? Dedicated to the living memory of the crew of Apollo 1, and it lists the names. They gave their lives in service to their country in the ongoing exploration of humankind's final frontier. We remember them not for how they died, but for those ideals for which they live. And another plaque, and this is where they got the name Ad Astra per Aspera for the exhibit. This is showing a badge board that was actually out at the pad, and the clock is the time when the fire happened, and the badges are the actual badges of people that were working there that night. Some of them, 27 or so, ended up in the hospital from fire. And actually, my husband wanted me to tell this story. There was one man that we met, and so he's got to be in his 80s, that he was at the 150-foot level. He got blasted back, couldn't get down, couldn't get to a staircase or an elevator, and climbed down the outside of the tower, which is kind of like 150 feet of scaffolding. And at dark, it was 6:30 at night. Amazing. And there were, I think, 5 or 6 that got the Medal of Honor. Yeah. So that's on display there too. These are some quotes that they got when they interviewed the family members to get a feel for what these men were like. So they have some quotes on the wall. And these are some more. And then what you do is you enter this portal going forward, and this is a smoke wall with the patch, and you walk through that wall. And then on the other side, they call it the Hero's Walk, and this describes that. This is the actual gantry that the Apollo astronauts walked on to get to their capsule, and these men went to the moon that passed through this actual gantry. And then you end up in the White Room, so you're looking into a capsule with the 3 astronauts sitting in there. And I think there's one more. And then you exit out into, right around the corner over here is the Lunar Theater. So it shows the progression and where we went after. It really is, I wish I could explain that glass. It's really amazing, but if you get a chance, you should go down and see it. Thank you.
While we're getting the mic set up here for the last part of our programming for this evening, we're going to have a conversation with the Chaffees, and this is where the question cards that you were asked to fill out, we're going to take some of those questions, and we'll have Bob Spellman here, and of course Dave DeBruyn, myself, and then Sheryl. We'll get our mics on here so that everything's in order. So just bear with us as we get everything connected here. Turn the podium mic off so that won't interfere.
Is everybody plugged in?
Everyone plugged in.
All right, great.
We haven't had any issues yet. You know, I've been wanting to use that phrase, we can land a man on the moon, why can't we? So far so good.
Well, Sheryl, thank you very much. I truly enjoyed your presentation, and it echoed other stories that I've heard. Interestingly, Glen talked about walking on Roger Chaffee Memorial Boulevard and seeing the old runway below. And I had heard that when Roger would come home to visit his parents, that he would be flying one of those T-38s and he would drop down and he'd buzz over the house
Right.
in the days long before cell phones, so that his parents would know to drive to the airport and pick him up. And it sounds like it was the same thing that he was doing, but he had his tank parked at the
Yeah.
airport. So,
Right.
well, we have some questions that have been submitted. It says, how did you start to work for NASA? And what is your favorite memory from that? Why don't you tell us a little bit about the road where you went from being the child, the 8-year-old child, and then getting to working for NASA?
Well, I was a young mother of 2, and basically I needed a job. And my grandfather asked if I would be interested in working for NASA. And I thought, well, maybe, I wasn't real keen on it, but I thought, yeah, okay, I can give it a try. So he worked it through, I think, one of the Michigan congressmen, and got me a temporary job with NASA. I started as a clerk. I didn't even know how to type, and so I went into the personnel offices, human resources, where I started. They taught me how to type. They taught me how to use the Commodore computer. That was a long time ago.
Commodore 64.
What's that?
I know, but probably a lot of these people don't know.
Did you
what that
start
is.
in Florida, or were you in
Yes.
Houston?
No, I was in Florida at Kennedy. I spent my whole career at Kennedy. And after a couple of years, NASA finally offered me a permanent position, and I took it. And I grew, I grew to like the job. I mean, it was tough at first. And there were a lot of tough times when I thought, what am I doing here? But eventually it got to be family. The people that I work with, they were great people.
So the family feel was the part.
Probably,
That's your
yeah.
best
I
memory?
mean, that's what I miss the most since I've retired, are the people, your morning chats in the morning while you're having coffee and trying to figure out what you're going to do all day.
Now this question says, how do they determine the order of the astronauts? And there's not further explanation. I'm thinking maybe it has to do with commander or pilot or the order that they sit in the seats. Is that right? Or is it who gets lined up for which flight? Or which missions? Can we get a little input on that question?
On the patch.
On the patch.
The display on
Oh.
the patch, okay.
On the flight patch?
Yeah.
The names? Do you know how that was put together?
Isn't it Grissom on the top? White, Chaffee? But I think Grissom's, I don't know, but I'm assuming Grissom would be on the top because he was the commander.
Right.
Yeah.
Grissom's on the top, White on the right.
Yeah,
Chaffee.
and then and that was, I think, also the way they were seated in there. But I really don't know. I'm just thinking Grissom would be on the top since he was commander.
I would have said reverse alphabetical order. But is there anything in particular about your father that you'd like us to know that you haven't already told us?
I don't think so. He was very, he liked to build things. I mean, he built rifles, he built waterfalls. We talked about that earlier today. He was always busy,
Wasn't he trained in engineering as part of his curriculum at Purdue? I know the comment was made, I've heard it, that he was incredibly creative as far as being able to design and understand how things worked.
Yeah,
That was
sure.
one factor in his
Yeah.
being selected.
I noted that when he was in the 8th grade, he wrote a career term paper, and he indicated he wanted to be an electronic engineer, I think he called it at the time, and he was particularly interested in radios and electronics. I imagine that fits in with that curiosity and that scientific mind.
Yeah.
I also noted one of the plaques that had the quotes. One of them was authored by you, and while I couldn't read the whole thing, it ended with in something like, "You always knew you could count on his word or his integrity." Can you tell us the rest of that? Do you remember that quote?
I don't remember the entire quote. Sorry. But I think I was just trying to relay that he was good to his word. He was an honest man. He was, he was just everything that people say. I mean, I when I talk to people that know him, I have not heard a bad thing about him.
And I can echo that too from what readings that I've done on Roger, is remember, he was the rookie on this mission, and this was the first flight of a new spacecraft. And it was almost unprecedented to have a rookie crew member on board. The very first Gemini mission, Gemini 3 that flew, a brand new spacecraft after Mercury, had 2 seasoned pilots, astronauts on board that had flown before. And in Apollo 1, we had Grissom, of course, who had flown twice previously, followed by Ed White, who flew in Gemini and was the first American to do a spacewalk. But Chaffee had no flown record as far as a spaceflight prior to this. So I think it says a lot about his character among not only the astronauts, but the administration that make those decisions, that to appoint somebody brand new and one of the youngest astronauts selected to such a critical role said a lot about his character.
Yeah,
Probably
I
as
agree.
well as the fact that to fly a spacecraft, you have to be an engineer on board as opposed to a mere pilot.
Right.
This question asks of you or the family, in case you want to chime in, what is the most memorable thing that you can share from the dedication ceremony last month at Cape Kennedy?
I'll address that. It was listening to Sheryl do her speech in front of almost 1,000 people, similar to what she did tonight, and with the likes of Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin and the head of NASA and the head of the Space Center, and she did a wonderful job on a tough day. It was really impressive.
By the way, that's Dave Paquette, who I mentioned earlier. His connection to the Chaffees, if you don't know, is he is the son of Roger B. Chaffee's sister. It's his nephew, Donna Chaffee. So we have more Chaffees here.
The second coolest thing was the flyover by
Yes.
Apollo 4.
That's what I was, that flyover was pretty awesome.
So
Yeah.
a low pass over the memorial.
Memorial.
Three passes.
Mm-hmm.
That last one he was all the mail. By the time you heard him, he's gone.
I imagine the sights and sounds were overwhelming at times down there. Well, Thank you. Well, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but that is the extent of the questions. Are there any more questions out there that you wanted to submit?
Mark?
So, through your work with NASA, what kinds of improved safety measures have you seen over the time? Like how they tried to continually improve safety in the spacecraft?
Yeah, I'm not, probably not good on that. I mean, we know about the hatch. Come on,
Well,
Grady.
the O-ring, I mean, on
The O-rings.
the calendar, you know.
Oh, yeah, and then when Columbia, you know, they
They
put the
determined-
camera on.
Yeah, they, you know, the foam was falling off the tanks during launches before, almost every launch. And they determined it really wasn't a problem, that it ended up being a problem.
Yeah.
Because it hit the aileron, hit the front leading edge of the wing, right where all the hydraulic lines went through, which it took out all three systems. When it burned through.
Yeah, so then they added a way that they could check on the tiles while they were up there to see if there was significant damage.
Of course, there were a lot of changes too that they made to the Apollo spacecraft immediately, and its environs as a result of the tragedy.
Right.
The biggest was the hatch, which Sheryl pointed out. You saw that last photo of the Block 2 hatch, which was the improved hatch, and the biggest improvement, of course, was the hatch moved outward. It opened outward rather than inward. And then a lot of other changes that they made to procedures, reducing the 100% pure oxygen, removing flammable material inside the spacecraft, getting fire extinguishers on the launch pad that could put out a fire that was oxygen rich. A lot of different procedures that needed to be made. And the accident, of course, brought all of our attention to, NASA's attention to making those happen.
Do you know, has there ever been another need to blow the hatch?
It's interesting you should mention that, because if you watch the HBO miniseries From the Earth to the Moon, which was shown in 1998, it's a very good documentary or docudrama chronicling the Apollo program. It's hosted by Tom Hanks. And the Apollo 1 episode that they had there is quite moving and quite accurate. And one of the things that ironic about the accident was, of course, Grissom was on the spacecraft for Apollo 1, and previously he was the second American to fly into space. And those that might remember, when he splashed down after they landed in his Mercury capsule, his hatch, which had an explosive hatch, prematurely blew. The hatch flew off, and of course the ocean water just rushed in, and they lost the spacecraft, and they nearly lost Gus Grissom because they were trying to get both of them. Fortunately, Grissom, survived. But one of the very weird twists of fate was, because of that accident, they intentionally, or one of the reasons they designed the inward opening hatch and also to not have it as an explosive hatch, was because of fear of that happening again. So in the irony of history, Grissom's explosive hatch and the changes they made as a result of that, in a way, contributed to the accident, because they could not remove that hatch explosively on the launch pad in time. It took a tremendous amount of effort, and they weren't able to do that. So that's one reason too they displayed the hatch, because it was such a critical piece of equipment now at the Space Center.
Jen?
I've heard that there are 3 stars named after the Apollo 1 astronauts. Do you know anything about that? Like, they were each astronaut.
I think there
has
are,
a
yeah.
star named after them for navigation purposes.
I know that I have heard that there are stars named, but it's been a long time since I heard that.
The only one that I remember was Rigor for Roger.
I suppose I'm the one that's supposed to remember that, but I don't. I do know that there is a crater on Mars that's named after Chaffee.
And the moon too.
And I think I've heard that there are some stars, but it's not coming up into the conscious part of my brain.
So on the night of the 30th, at pad 34 and 27th, they do a ceremony out there every year. And during the ceremony, it was popping over. And one of our local congressmen were there, and a couple of them were looking up. When they started playing taps, the sky opened up, and there was 3 stars up there.
Yes.
Yeah.
woman who worked at NASA for 33 years. I wondered, number one, if you saw the movie Hidden Figures, and number two, if you have or haven't, if you saw any changes in what it was like to be a woman working at NASA over those 33 years.
I have not seen Hidden Figures, and I really want to see it. Yeah, I have seen I guess there were a lot of changes. When I started, there weren't really women in the higher level positions, but as time went on, I mean, we ended up with a woman deputy center director, so, and there's a lot, I mean, women launch directors, that just wasn't common, 33 years ago, but it's pretty common now. There's a lot of women out there doing some pretty amazing things.
Women astronauts, too.
Yeah, women astronauts.
Definitely. I got something. I'd like to mention one thing, a personal recollection. Glenn had me on such a tight leash that I wasn't able to work it in in the PowerPoint. But one of my ambitions was to get Roger Chaffee to come back to Grand Rapids to do a talk. And I had hoped to meet him. This was, of course, prior to the event. And when the event took place, of course, that meant that that was not to be. But I did get a chance to meet Gene Cernan, who I found to be a very, very personable man, and incredibly emotional, as I mentioned briefly during the ceremony. And probably most of you know what he went on to do, but it bears repeating. He became, I think, the third person to walk in space in a Gemini flight. There was a Russian who was first, whose name is escaping me, and then of course it was Ed White, and then Cernan did a extravehicular activity. And then in Apollo 10, which was immediately prior to the landing, and I believe in April of that year, just prior to the July landing, he was the pilot aboard the little LEM, the little bug-like landing craft that actually detached from an Apollo command module in lunar orbit and went down and scampered among the craters. And I remember listening to him in absolute ecstasy. For a serious astronaut, he was just having a delightful time flying this little bug among the craters and realizing that I'd actually met him just a couple of years before. And then, of course, we all remember, most of us in this room would remember that in Apollo 17, the last mission, he was the last person to lift his foot from the lunar surface. And then they actually had a camera aboard that allowed you to see the top part of the vehicle blasting back up to the mothership. All very memorable stuff. And it was just wonderful to remember that Gene Cernan was a part of that, someone I did get a chance to meet, and who, as we all know, died just mid-January, 10 days before the 50th anniversary, and only 2 months prior to his 83rd birthday.
I might add one final thing before we probably should close, is that Chaffee, if you don't realize it, did make it to the moon in name, because one of the plaques that they placed on the surface of the moon as part of the Apollo 15 mission was a metal plaque with a small fallen astronaut figure that an artist made here on Earth. And the Apollo 15 crew that landed on the surface of the moon placed this small plaque, which included all the names of astronauts who had lost their lives in our way to the stars, to the moon, and beyond. And they took a photograph of that with that little figure next to it, and you can see Roger's name along with the other crew members prominently on that plaque. So in name and of course in spirit, he did make it to the moon, which I always thought was
That is great. And I would like to add that the 50th Roger B. Chaffee Memorial Scholarship is going to be awarded on May 4 this coming spring. We will be having a banquet. We're going to have a fabulous guest speaker, astronaut Jack Lausma. If you'd like more information, please feel free to go online for the Roger B. Chaffee Scholarship Fund. Visit our webpage. If you have any information or need any information or have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Thank you.
And with that, we encourage you folks who would like to stay for our 9 o'clock planetarium show. We are showing the dark side of the moon.
I think we could probably start it a little sooner than that.
Okay, and that's right at the planetarium. If you want to go, you just show your badge and includes admission.
Can we say a couple things, because
Sure.
the museum is closed.
Okay.
And if you could just meet us, Emily, John, and I, over by
Take a
the
group over there?
registration desk, we can all go over together.
Okay.
We'll give you about 10 or 15 minutes to take care of what needs to be taken care of, and then we'll head over there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That concludes our evening. Thank you, Sheryl.